Hello and welcome everybody to the UN Decade webinar on AI and ecosystem restoration. We have a lot of participants today, so the topic is apparently of great interest. What we would love to do today is to share how artificial intelligence can help ecosystem restoration, but also some of the risks it poses to environmental sustainability. And to do that, we have a phenomenal panel of experts on AI. And you in the audience don't need to be experts on AI. So if you don't know much about AI, you will hopefully learn a lot. Even if you know a lot about AI, hopefully you will learn something today. My name is Tim Christoffersen. I'm Vice President of Climate Action at Global Salesforce, the global technology company. We're a world market leader in customer relationship management built on trusted AI. So I've been asked by the UN Decade, where I sit on the advisory board, to put together and moderate this webinar. And if you can start the slides, the UNEP team, I'd just like to briefly give a highlight of our panel, who we have on today's expert list. And for anybody in the audience, please already get prepared to ask questions to this great group of people. We will be answering questions in the last half hour of this webinar. The questions can be asked in the chat and the Q&A function, and we'll obviously do our best to answer them. And we will also share a pack of resources with you after this webinar. So all the panelists have shared with us resources for more reading on artificial intelligence, and that will be made available to all of you. So if we could go to the slides, please, Emily or Caroline, that would be great. And I see we're getting up to almost 200 participants already. That is phenomenal. Thank you all for being here. And this webinar will be recorded. And as I said, we will also have a resource pack for all of you that we'll make available afterwards. So who's with us on the panel today? We have Naue Flores, who's founder and principal R&D consultant at Kinray Hub. Clinton Odwar, who's head of data science at Amini, an AI startup based in Nairobi. Anna Lerner, who is the CEO of the Climate Collective, doing a lot for AI startups in the nature and climate space. Keith Aguada, who's the CEO and co-founder of Producers Trust, a global farmers cooperative, and we'll learn more about how to reach out to smallholder farmers from Keith. And Jasper Kleinsman, who works at the World Agroforestry Center and is a remote sensing scientist who supports one of the UN Decade's World Restoration flagships, the Regreening Africa World Flagship. We will hear from each of them shortly. I will just like to give a bit of context on AI and sustainability. So if we can move to the next slide, please. I'd like to outline what the key opportunities are, but also what some of the risks are from AI. You go to the next slide. We are basically at a point in the AI revolution that we call the wave 3. After predictive AI, which has now been around for more than 10 years, in some cases longer, we've moved into generative AI. That's the wave that has caught the world's attention with large language models like ChatGPT. But we're now in a wave that is going much further than that, the wave of autonomous AI and AI agents. To give you an example of what that is, you're most likely familiar with chatbots. So AI agents are a new form of chatbots that can take autonomous action and have the reasoning capacity of large language models. So it is basically like speaking with a real person who can act on your request and change your order or your hotel reservation or send you an update on the latest restoration project that you are following. All of these things can be done autonomously now by AI. The next wave that is then coming is artificial general intelligence. And for some reason, the picture flipped upside down there on, at least on my screen. But that wave is coming, and we know that AI already, with the first three waves, is changing the way we work and the way all of us can collaborate in every aspect of our lives. So whether we are already in touch with AI or not, it is a very important topic to get involved with. Next slide, please. There is what I would call an AI trust gap. While it is the #1 priority for clearly all CEOs in the world at the moment, a majority of consumers actually don't believe AI is safe and secure. And there are good reasons for concern, because there's still a lot of bias and toxicity in AI training, which we will hear a little bit more about how to address that. There's still hallucinations. There are questions about data rights and data privacy, which we'll also speak a little bit about. And last but not least is energy consumption. I'll go a little bit deeper into that topic now. Next slide. So the compute requirements to train AI models have grown exponentially. And if you look at the left-hand axis there, every change means a doubling of compute power. So the large language models that you're familiar with, like Claude or GPT-4, already take twice or sometimes many times more compute power than earlier models. Next slide, please. And that, of course, comes at a time when we cannot really afford a rise in energy consumption if it comes from energy that causes emissions, because we have to reduce our emissions. These are the IPCC pathways. And as you can see, we are currently not on track, even for the 2-degree pathway, let alone the 1.5. Next slide, please. So against that need to reduce emissions, what we see is that currently AI could quadruple data center impact on energy consumption. At present, it is less than 500 terawatt hours per year, or less than 1% of global power generation. But if it's accelerating at a pace that we don't control or don't steer well, AI and data centers could use up to 2.5 terawatt hours per year. And to give you a comparison, the entire European Union produces about 3,000 terawatt hours. So this would be close to the entire energy consumption of the EU. Next slide, please. So what we have to do to make AI sustainable is definitely much on the technology side: right size the large language models, use efficient hardware, put data centers in low carbon regions where the energy is already renewable, increase the transparency, how it is produced and what the energy requirements are, and also boost those cases where AI can help the climate and nature. This is something where Salesforce invests, for example, if you can go to the next slide, in a number of use cases where we have invested in companies like Pano AI, that uses AI to automatically detect, verify, and classify wildfires in real time. And it is a balancing act at the moment where every one of us has to get involved. We can also get involved through our personal consumption habits of AI. Remember that for every generated image, it is about the same energy consumption as charging your iPhone 50%. And for each ChatGPT conversation, it's equivalent to the use of 1 bottle of water for data center cooling. So we all have to be aware of how we use AI and for what purpose, and if the purpose is justified and the AI is generated in a sustainable way, we'll be on a good track. Altogether, there's a study last year by Google and the Boston Consulting Group estimating that AI could help solve 5 to 10% of the climate crisis through increased efficiency, through emission reductions resulting from better planning, through new technologies that would increase, for example, the efficiency of grid power distribution in large population centers. But we have to ensure that the scale comes down on the side of AI positive impacts. Go to the next slide, please. And that, of course, includes a lot of the activities of NGOs on the ground. And Salesforce, the company I work for, has made available an AI accelerator with funding for NGOs that can ensure we make the best use of AI for example, achieving better matchmaking between funders and project developers in the marine space. So we funded the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, ORA, with what they call the Octopus Desk, is a matchmaking desk that uses AI to ensure funding is put to good use. Next slide, please. And with that short overview, we will now dive a little bit deeper into each of these topics and focus a bit more on the opportunities of AI, although we will also hear about data rights and the importance of clear agreements. And we go to the next slide, showing again our panelists. We will start with Nawe Flores, who is working for an organization called Kinray Hub, and also has been leading the discussions on indigenous peoples and local communities participation in the context of the CBD. So Nawe, happy to have you with us today. If you have joined us by now.
Thank you. I don't know if I'm in the room.
There you are, yes. Very good. We can see and hear you. So Nawe, I would love to know from you, what do you see as the main risk and opportunities of AI in the context, in particular, of local restoration action and indigenous-led restoration action?
Yeah, that's fascinating, and thank you for having me. And we hopefully this session will be informative for the participants. I think definitely I would like to start by addressing the ramifications and implications to the digital supply chain, which is the data that we're collecting. And for us, and we can think about this in the upstream of the data supply chain. We need to think about how AI is also dealing with the titling and deeds of the land, where the restoration efforts are taking place or are under development. And primarily this become even more concerning when we have environmental markets coming into the space, biodiversity markets, we have ecosystem service compensations, we have the carbon market, of course. So for us, this has been a lot of times looking into the deeds and the titles of our land is a risk when AI, because there is a opportunity in there to falsify a lot of the records, and primarily in indigenous lands and local communities lands that historically they don't have a bureaucratic paperwork that you can trace it back. So that puts a tremendous risk in this. And in case in point, in the Andes, we see this already happening now. Maybe about 5 years ago, before AI was so strongly embedded within society, it was already happening, a lot of falsifications of land property in these restoration efforts. Now I just space forward. Now deeds of land that is being cleared because of glacial retreats and also deforestation, those just become lands that could be easily dispossessed by falsified records that are created by AI machinery, and they are lacking that. So the opportunity that we see in there for indigenous community is is a legitimacy deeds and titles that it can actually provide and secure the upstream supply chain. Because the thing is that we are seeing in the environmental market, we're seeing a false paradox that we don't have how to verify and certify the restoration efforts and the funding efforts, let's call it for community engagement and capacity building, are actually being delivered and are actually doing the social, economical, environmental, and cultural impacts that is intended. We have the verifications at a very high level, but not at the ground level, not at the subnational level. So by having AI creating AI automatizing these legitimacy deeds and titles, indigenous communities, local community has a mechanism that can actually verify and certify that the data is actually collected by the community. The data disaggregation is actually in the interest of pushing their rights to sustainable development. Their data is contributed to their data economy, decent growth and employment. So these things, by securing at the upstream supply chain, is where we see the greatest opportunity for bringing AI into indigenous communities, with the caveat that this will require, as you mentioned, this is for us also debating, how much of this is in contradiction to our nature rights, that we want to protect nature, but yet AI will consume a lot of these resources. So finding that, once again, for indigenous people, is finding the right balance between how much of AI can we embed in our data prototyping versus how much of that is about human nature agency to bring these things forward.
Thank you. And that's, of course, exactly why it is so important that your research focuses on that topic. So to me, it sounds like there is a new form of digital literacy also necessary for everybody working in the space, because I perceive that AI is not only a new technology, it's a complete step change in the opportunities and the risks. So where do you see the current perception of AI, especially within the indigenous peoples and local communities that are also involved in the CBD discussions, for example?
Yeah, there is definitely the digital literacy lack. At the space of these international convenings, we hear the word AI, and as you mentioned, immediately the notion goes to chatbots. And this could be the OpenAI chatbot, and one of the pieces that is missing really is the digital literacy of AI as the function of what. What is the job of AI? What can AI do? When do I use it for what? Having this knowledge between how much resources is AI consuming and what AI is doing, that digital literacy is not present in indigenous communities and local communities. It exists this notion of there is this sensors, data collection mechanisms, there is all this knowledge that's coming in from NGOs, from project developers, but the conversation of AI stops at the moment of data. It stops right there. And that, to us, is a triangle of an issue. Data provides information. AI, it processes the information, and often what it ends up doing when our indigenous co-designing and having the digital literacy is that we end up with misinformation and disinformation. So it creates this cycle, the cycle of disfranchising indigenous co-design data prototyping in this context. So the digital literacy in the community that is decentralized, that is federated learning, is completely lacking when we are talking about AI. We only are talking about to indigenous communities is at a very superficial level of data collection, and then even in data collection, our question often comes down to placing indigenous people's rights, but also placing the rights of the local communities and so forth. Who is collecting the data? When is the data collected? Where is it collected, and where is it going?
And I think that data literacy and the AI literacy is, of course, something that is a steep learning curve for all of us, but in particular for those communities that are on the front lines of both ecosystem conservation and restoration. So please, everybody, get ready to type your questions in the Q&A for Nawe. We'll come back at the end. And we'll go to Clinton next, who works for a startup called Amini. And in the meantime, I also see a lot of questions in the chat about entering the meeting. So this is a Teams broadcast. It is not possible for the over 230 people we now have to use their mic or their camera, but you can put questions in the Q&A. And we can then also later give the spotlight and the camera to a few people who ask questions, or if there are a lot of questions, we will pick them from the Q&A. So Clinton, we'll go to you next. And in the meantime, can I ask the UNEP team to prepare the poll? We will go to that poll after we've heard from Clinton. So Clinton, you're working for a startup in Nairobi called Amini. And the focus is on bridging the digital divide between Africa and other countries and regions. So what are your hopes and expectations from AI?
Yeah, thank you, Tim. And I'm happy to be here to provide some contributions in this wonderful discussion. So first of all, I'll start with some few statistics. If you look at Africa, most of Africa's wealth is usually integrated within a natural capital or a natural system. By if I can give some numbers to that, it usually ranges from about 30 to 50% depending on the country, of which slightly over 60% of these people engage in agriculture and forestry as their main source of livelihood. So when we are talking about bridging the digital divide, we are also referring to ensuring that these people in these countries who are very rich in the natural resources but also historically underrepresented when it comes to technology access are active participants in shaping on how AI is being built, rather than just being consumers or just being recipients of external solutions, because they matter also, and they need to be active contributors so that they'll have the capability of solving the problems that matters most to them, because they're the ones who understand them the most. So, and actually this is a question that we usually constantly ask ourselves at Amini. How can we leverage this richness in natural ecosystem and natural capital and emerging technologies such as AI to create opportunities for more than the 1 billion people that currently live in the continent. And when it comes to, for example, the context that we are talking about ecosystem restoration, we have seen quite a lot of wonderful applications whereby AI is being used to improve a livelihood by just focusing on what people are currently doing and the natural ecosystem. In the world, for example, for agriculture, we usually have a very big challenge, for example, when it comes to financial inclusivity, whereby people don't have access to things such as credit. But it doesn't mean that it's wrong, for example, for those people to miss opportunities that come from financial services such as insurance, credit, and many others. So one of the applications that you have seen that has really worked so well is, for example, trying to use AI and remote sensing, for example, to monitor farmers' croplands historically over time, to come up with some sort of a proxy of credit scoring, some sort of a credit scoring proxy to enable us these people to be part of the financial system, because at the end of the day, they need to support their livelihood so that they are also resilient to some of the challenges posed by climate change. Others that we have seen are, for example, trying to come up with AI-driven analysis using like a satellite imagery and AI, for example, to try identify areas that are best suited for some restoration programs. For example, reforestation, of which like communities can then get, for example, can get compensated or incentivized through programs like a carbon credit and many others. So we see like quite a lot of opportunities, especially in this space when you just try to integrate natural ecosystems and AI. And as much as mobile technology in Africa accelerated financial inclusion, for example, through mobile money for people who are conversant with Safaricom's M-Pesa, if you come from Kenya or just the Eastern African region, we hope that AI will also serve like a very good, powerful equalizer with such a trend, whereby you're going to create like a more economic, more economic opportunities for the billions of people living in the continent. Yeah.
AI as an equalizer and to democratize access to finance and knowledge. I like that view. And personally, I also have to say it's great to see Nairobi becoming a bit of a tech hub in this regard. And for full disclosure, Salesforce is an investor in Amini, but I only found that out after we had invited you as a speaker. But it's great the work that you're doing. And what specifically do you think needs to happen so developing countries are not left behind in the current AI race?
Yeah, I think with that, we'll just go back to history and see like what actually spearheaded the explosion of AI some few years back. And it was mostly attributed to three things. The first one is talent. All of a sudden, we had like a very big pop-up of independent research labs, academic institution contributing like a breakthrough research in architectural design, and also new like computer architectures that spearheaded the AI revolution. So there's still like some work to be done when it comes to developing local content, local talent in form of capacity building activities. It can be through like through startups, academic institution, international collaboration. But then at the end of the day, we just need to make sure that we generate like a new generation of AI talent within the continent to solve their own problems, because they're the ones who understand them the most. Yeah. The second one, of course, is infrastructural development. Compute, we have talked about compute and how it has like quite a lot of effects on energy and climate and the rest. So we still need to up our game when it comes to infrastructural development, investing in compute, and it can be through like it's something that can be driven like locally, or through also like a multifaceted collaboration with international organizations. Then the third one, of course, data. So data is like a very fundamental in AI, and in AI they show like this notion of garbage in, garbage out. But in some regions of the world, for example, in Africa, the garbage in sometimes show like even very scarce. So there's still like a lot of work to be done when it comes to like bringing data from generating like data from people that can be used for these AI systems. And sometimes surely the data, it's not that the data doesn't exist. The data exists, but sometimes it's siloed in different organizations. So we just need a way to bring all this data together and to be made like openly available. I think with those three, we can spearhead the revolution, and we'll make sure that no one is left behind when it comes to AI. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Clinton, and fully agree with the need to have not only sufficient data, but also balanced data for training. Because let's remember that one of the reasons we have bias in large language models is that, of course, a lot of the internet content is generated and housed in developed countries. So models will be biased if they only train on that data, and we don't make a conscious effort to include data and perspectives from the large groups of smallholder farmers, for example, that have to play a key role, but who will not be as represented in the training data unless we make conscious effort to rebalance that. So we'll do we'll plunge into the technology here now and try to do a poll. So the UNEP team, if you can run the poll. And in the meantime, I would like to remind everybody in the audience that the way to ask questions is to put them in the Q&A. You can ask a question. You can also vote questions up or down, which makes it easier for us to see which question is of most interest also to other participants. And then we will get to questions in about half an hour. So UNEP team, let's see if the poll works. Caroline, are you on the case?
Yes, it has been launched.
Okay. So let's see the polls. Who do you represent? We have still people coming in with their response. The other questions are, what is your level of AI knowledge and usage? It's just so that we know a little bit more about the audience, where you are at. Are you aware of key data protections and data right legislations in your country? And do you see AI mainly as a risk or an opportunity, or both? We'll give you some more time to respond. I can't see the results yet, but if UNEP team, if you can come back to us once the responses are in. We have 54 responses so far, and there's over 200 people in the meeting. So let's give it a bit more time. And in the meantime, we'll go to our next panelist, who is Keith Aguada. So Keith, thank you for joining us. You're CEO and co-founder of Producers Trust. Tell us a little bit more about what you do at Producers Trust. You help smallholder farmers connect better with markets. So what role can AI play in accelerating that necessary connection, and what role does Producers Trust play?
Great, thank you, Tim, and it's great to be here with everyone. Producers Trust is a global network of agricultural producers, and we work with technology and partnerships to drive solutions that enhance farmer well-being. So when you speak to farmers, their biggest concern is usually money. How do I get paid on time? How do I cover my costs? And how do I get treated fairly to be a farmer? It's really a business value proposition. And the opportunity with AI that we're finding with farmers, specific to market linkage, which is this aspect of how do we connect farmers better to markets, is around information, data, and resources. And so when we look at an actual supply chain, and most of our work is focused in developing countries, and what we see is that farmers are often in poverty or struggling economically. And we believe that their ability to connect more directly to markets and to receive better information and access to resources is an incredible unlock for farmers to lift up their economic well-being. And the key unlock that we are seeing is around sustainability. And the reason is that markets are demanding products that are lowering carbon emissions, that don't have child labor, that are better using water and resources. And so what we're looking at is how to align these market demands for more sustainable products with the farmer's ability to access resources to transition their practices into sustainable outcomes. And we see AI as this key unlock where we can organize the requirements of not just the markets downstream, but of all the resources and stakeholders within that supply chain ecosystem, or as we call regenerative landscape. And so AI's ability to organize data, information, resources from banks, insurance companies, climate finance groups, de-risking agencies, governments, extension services, all these stakeholders who are operating in silos to impact farmers, to now bring together those resources, organize it with a tool like AI, and deliver it to farmers in a system that they can relate to, which is often WhatsApp. And so the two key points that we're finding AI to be a major unlock in farmer economic well-being through transition to sustainability is, number one, the ability to organize the stakeholder requirements, starting with markets and finance, to reach farmers for infrastructure, for loans, for grants, for other resources. But then how that information and data reaches a farmer can come through this agent concept that Tim, you were mentioning earlier, where we can synthesize all of this complex data information resources from many stakeholders and then deliver it in a very simplified way to a farmer, where a farmer is saying, how do I make more money? How do I connect to the market? And through those simple questions and through these simple engagements, we can start to drive their practices towards sustainability and enhancing their economic well-being in a very simplified value proposition to farmers. And so where we see the greatest value right now of AI is, how do we take a lot of unstructured data? How do we take a lot of different requirements across siloed resources and then bring it into a very simple format that farmers and extension services being the individuals on the ground who reach the farmers to provide them solutions and support them, how do we interact with them in a very simplified way that actually is connected into a robust backend of data requirements and resources to drive markets and finance?
Yeah, exactly. And always the latest research. I tend to think of that opportunity as a PhD in agricultural science in my pocket that you can pull out at any time and ask any question, and gives you an answer that is specific to your farm and to your field and to your crop and to the weather and to the time of year you're in. So obviously the opportunities are huge, but getting there is not easy. So could you give us an example of where this is being developed or rolled out?
Yeah, so one example is in Andhra Pradesh, India, where they have a movement of natural farming, regenerative agriculture, climate smart ag, which has become quite robust. And where we believe one of the key levers to go from a massive scale adoption, which has already happened, into maybe a statewide adoption to reach 5 or 6 million farmers, which can spread across India, is economic incentive. You have the first movers who believe in it, they're lowering pesticides, they're healthier, they're adamant, and you have these first adopters who just believe in the cause and they're fully bought in. But we believe that the large scale adoption of farming into regenerative agriculture is about the economic unlock. And so we're looking at, how do we connect in the outputs of farmers to markets in a way that says, well, if you switch out of chemical fertilizer and go into locally or farm-made biological inoculations and inputs, did you know that you can connect to this market? If you validate this data better, there's a market here, or there's carbon credits there that can actually be achieved in your farm. So we're seeing and starting to learn about, how can we connect the practices that are done today to existing markets, and then support the extension services and the farmers and farmer to farmer networks to say, well, if you adopt these practices, now here's the new markets that you can connect to, and here's the guaranteed purchases, and here's the new infrastructures that can be built through third-party finance to enhance the value of your goods. So we're really on this front line of understanding, how do you connect this farmer and extension service engagement to a whole ecosystem and landscape of market, finance, and other resources and opportunities.
Great, and I happen to know that project in Andhra Pradesh from my time at UNEP, and there are 6 million smallholder farmers, so that alone would be a project of unprecedented size, but there's 1 billion smallholder farmers in the world. So AI suddenly makes it possible to structure these very large programs and projects, and that leads me on to the next topic. And thanks again, Keith, phenomenal work you're doing, and get ready for questions. There's already a few for you in the Q&A lined up. We'll go to our next panelist, who is Jasper Kleinsman, who works in the remote sensing division of the World Agroforestry Center, so just across the fence from UNEP in Nairobi. And Jasper, you are working actually on a UN World Restoration Flagship, so one of those very large-scale restoration efforts. Can you tell us a bit more about how AI has helped to improve monitoring in that flagship? And I think we'll have to shift the spotlight. At least I can't see Jasper, but
Yeah, I think the camera's on. I think,
There you go.
yeah. Am I in the spotlight?
I am not sure. I'm also on Teams on my browser, like the majority of us, I think.
Okay.
So yes, now you are.
Okay,
Thank you,
that's
Timo.
good.
So yes, how do you use AI for basically the Regreening Africa is the flagship you're working on, and there are 17 world flagships now. So what you've learned is obviously valuable for across the world and the participants.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tim, and thanks all the other speakers for setting a great stage already. So within the Regreening Africa project, which is, as you said, the UN Decade flagship, we had an aim to restore around 1 million hectares of land all across the African continent in 7 different countries. And that included various practices, right? So that was farmer managed natural regeneration, tree planting, and some other practices as well. And what we did within that project that we used, AI is quite a container or an umbrella term. So we used AI/machine learning to look at certain ecosystem properties and predict ecosystem properties over these large areas, to actually see if we can see changes over time. So those properties we can actually predict by having a very big database in the background, which we have collected over many different years, over around 15 years. And with around 40,000 sampling points at the moment, all in the tropics actually, and a lot of those sampling points are actually in Africa. So as you said, there is a big global bias in data sets, but because our data is very much from the African continent, we were able to make fairly high accurate predictions on key ecosystem properties such as soil organic carbon, but also tree cover, pH, grass, so multiple indicators. And then because we can predict that using remote sensing, so using various satellite images or sensors, using Landsat 8, Sentinel-1, Sentinel-2, climate indicators, and combining all of that together, combining it with those big data sets that we have on soil and vegetation health all across the continent, we could then predict over time whether certain interventions, whether they cause a change in some of these properties, whether they cause a change in tree cover or in soil organic carbon. So that's also one of the benefits, I think, that using AI and machine learning within this flagship is the scaling up of these type of analyses. We know for certain areas what the land health is exactly, and then we can scale it up on a continental level, which allows us to compare between different project areas how an intervention is going, but it also allows us to look back in time what the situation was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, because we have satellite data for that, or maybe even further back. And we can also keep on updating these models every time we have new satellite data. So it really allows us, having these models, to sort of shift through time, to see changes over time from multiple ecosystem indicators. So yeah, as I said, so the large scale monitoring was a very big help, and how we use machine learning and AI. But still, it was reliant on these ground truth data, right? Without these ground truth data sets, we're still flying blind. And I think it's important for 2 things, right? The bigger the data set, the more accurate your model can be, right? The more data we have for training, so that's really important. But then also for validation, right? We want to know how wrong our model is, right? If we can quantify, okay, we're predicting carbon here, but we know our error is so much kilogram or so much tons, then we know very well what we're predicting now, or what we're seeing now, is that within the error margin, or is it actually outside the error margin? So also for the validation purposes, having these ground truth data sets is very important.
Thank you. And there's several elements in what you said are fascinating for other projects. And one in particular is the cost of monitoring, because if you have these large areas, doing ground truthing can be very expensive. And bringing up the accuracy is of course one positive aspect with the help of machine learning and AI, but bringing down the costs is another one. And I think Africa actually has an advantage in what you said about the data availability, because ICRAF Soil Sample Lab has been active for decades in Africa and has, I think, the world's largest store of soil samples, including soil organic carbon. So that, of course, gives an advantage in this case, where these massive amounts of data can be put to good use. You're also involved in the monitoring task force of the UN Decade, for example. What do you see as the level of AI capacity and awareness across the UN Decade, and what do we have to do to improve that if needed?
Yeah, no, I think you're very right. I think within our organization, we have a lot of data, which is what allows us to do, right? So I think what is one key component that we need to keep on stressing is that, yes, it's amazing when we can do this type of analysis, but it really starts with having these ground truth data sets, right? So I think it is important within other UN Decade projects as well, is that there is a very solid sampling design of collecting these crucial data sets and then also feeding them into other existing continental or regional or global data sets as well. And then also having a plan of how the data that we're collecting now, because it takes a lot of money and effort to collect data on the ground. So having a clear plan of, once we collect this data, how are we going to use this to scale it up, to train our models? So I think it's really important to have a clear understanding of how these data that we collect, how we're going to use them in our project, and how we can feed them into existing products and data sets already. And I think I very often get the question if we can monitor this, if we can predict this, if we can analyze this. And I think the answer is always like, yes, if we have the data, right? And yes, if the data was collected with some of these end users in mind, right? Then we can do some of these things. So I think within the UN Decade, having a focus on data collection, I think, is really important. And then also afterwards sharing these data, right? I think Keith before, what he mentioned is a huge benefit of some of these large language models, or actually sometimes even a small language model, is that they are amazing for data communication as well, right? So if we have these big data sets, whether they are predicted or ground truth data, we can then use some of these language models to then sort of communicate these findings on, for instance, carbon stocks in the ground, or for instance, tree cover, or for instance, nitrogen level in the ground. We can predict those properties, and we can then feed that back using these language models in the background through WhatsApp or another type of application. So I think those are really sort of big potential areas how we can combine these language models with these predictive models in the background. And then also, yeah, I think that's a big potential that we can still look at further in the future.
Yeah, I think when we spoke earlier, you mentioned that the level of accuracy to predict soil organic carbon levels is now above 80%. And if you think from space, right, from satellites and different monitoring devices, and if you think back a few years ago, that sounded like a very far away technological possibility. And imagine what that could do for the planning of carbon projects, for example, but also for restoration, for agriculture, and for bringing down the cost of monitoring. So I think this technology has a lot of potential, but as you said, the data quality needs to be there and the capacity needs to be there. So thanks, Jesper, for that. We'll come back to you also in the chat. And just before we go to our final panelist, who's Anna Lerner, the CEO of the Climate Collective, I have an ask to everybody in the audience, please, and also to the panelists on the Q&A. So I know that there's a lot of questions already in the Q&A. So to repeat, anybody in the audience, if you want to ask questions, you can do that in the Q&A function. And I would also like to ask you, please, to, if there's a question somebody else has already asked, to go through those and then vote those questions up if you would also like to hear it answered, because we will not be able to answer all the questions live. But if you vote questions up, I can see easily which question has the most interest and which questions are relevant to a broader group, and we'll take those questions first. We'll try to answer the others afterwards in writing. My ask to the panelists is to please already go in there, and there are questions that are specifically to you. You can already start to type some of the answers in the comment box under the question, so that we are sure we make the best of our time. So audience, please continue to ask questions in the Q&A. vote for questions that you like to hear answered. So we're sure we cover at least those. And for the panelists, please already go in there and type in comments where you feel you can provide some more knowledge and information. So with that, we come to Anna Lerner, who's the CEO of the Climate Collective. And Anna, the Climate Collective is accelerating tech innovation in service of climate and nature. So what are the most interesting areas in your perspective when it comes to AI's ability to help us progress on nature goals?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Tim. And this is really, I've been typing so many notes and thoughts as I heard the other speakers. So I'm really inspired and I learned a lot already. So really appreciate the community and the conversation you're creating here. My first time using AI was in 2016 when I was working with the government of Jamaica. I was at the World Bank at the time, and we were trying to strengthen their electricity grid. So we built a model to predict non-technical losses. This was sort of the early days of AI, like you mentioned in your slide, more the prediction phase. Fast forward some years ago, I led Meta, former Facebook's response to the Sustainable Development Goals. And here we looked at things like computer vision to identify endangered animals from the millions of videos that come through Instagram from tourists on safari or whale watching, or match snake photos with anti-venom via WhatsApp group of like snake fanatics or snake researchers around the world. Today, we're really knee deep in this new generation of AI opportunities, and I think you framed it really well in the beginning. This is that type of AI that actually can create new content and ideas, including conversations, images, videos. It obviously also brings a lot of responsibility for the people who are involved in working in these technologies and for general society, I would say society at large, to make sure that you keep technologists and leaders accountable for where this is taking society. So at Climate Collective, as we were starting to focus more specifically on AI, we sat down to figure out where are the biggest opportunities for AI to help us advance nature and climate goals. We were not looking at, future completely new things that no one has invented yet. We were looking for more commercial grade solutions that could be deployed today. We're running out of time, both for nature and climate goals. So we think it's really important to create more of a level playing field and find the solutions that are ready to be deployed today. I can share some links on how we went about it, but in short, we aggregated 20 nature and policy frameworks, some of the most important for businesses, governments, and civil society, that gave us 190 goals and targets. We aggregated all of them, tried to see patterns and see where they were overlapping. And then we grouped AI's capabilities in 4 broad categories. For AI, here were the 4 categories, and I'll give you a snippet on where I think the biggest opportunities for nature restoration are. But again, we will share this grid with all of you. So if you want to look at the grid and kind of dive deeper, you can do that after this conversation. So 4 big areas. We talked about prediction and monitoring. So this is really where you use AI to forecast and model climate impacts. It can be detect changes via remote sensing, for example, which I think is really relevant for ecosystem restoration efforts. Optimization and efficiency, so enhancing systems and driving resource optimization to increase productivity or reduce waste. Again, super, super relevant if we're trying to restore all the ecosystems in the world. We really need to think about what are the least damage we can make and how can we build synergies on, if you have to do an intervention in this place, can you kind of align actors and make sure that you use your resources and the impact efficiently. Automation and action, this one I think actually is really interesting, and we're kind of moving into commercial viability here. So this is an area where we're talking about automating tasks at scale to accelerate these climate solutions. Even thinking for a second about those 20 climate and nature frameworks that led to 190 goals and targets. Even for a government official in Kenya, we have representatives from Kenya on the call, to keep track of all of those goals that they are working on and try to find the synergies and efficiencies across investments and priorities. That's really complicated. So this is where we think automations and agents could actually be really helpful in the coming years. And then the last one, both previous speakers spoke very well about this. I'll leave that, but knowledge and insights, really unlocking insights through massive data sets, doing analytics and improving decision making on these really complex ecosystems and the impacts of interventions, and trying to stat that out in more real time. Another area where we think it's really, really impactful.
Thank you, Anna. That is fascinating. And please do share that framework afterwards with everybody, because I think that will help us to understand where we could focus to make sure AI is useful for nature goals. It also reminds me of my time at the CBD Secretariat, and this was more than 10 years ago, when we compared manually the synergies between the 3 Rio conventions, because they all speak about forests, right, and land restoration. And this was in an Excel sheet, and we looked through the decisions and then copied and pasted all of very painstaking work and very limited applicability because it was not easy to share and to automate. Now, this is all possible, and also like to flag here the work of another great NGO that does phenomenal work, the Climate Policy Radar, which you also know, that is doing that for climate policy and soon hopefully for nature policy. So thank you for all the work that you do. Can I ask you also specifically, and I love that word, ecopreneurs, how can we collectively better support startups in this space? Not only NGOs, governments, which is of course essential, but also startups and companies to build bridges between technologies and nature restoration actors?
Yeah, it's a good question. And from my first job in climate, essentially 2007 in Mozambique, doing energy efficient cook stoves for carbon market projects. Obviously, technology has made massive leaps. We heard our friend from Kenya talk about mobile payments, and that was a complete revolution when I was at the World Bank, and we started thinking like, hold on, mobile payments, we can integrate that in our projects, and development will all of a sudden be so much more effective, and we can reach communities on the ground. And now we have the tools to also make sense of all of this, make sense of what nature is doing, how Earth is behaving, and also what people are doing. The reality is, it's not just online data that is biased. I worked a lot on gender data when I was at Facebook and Meta. And all gender data is biased because statistics, like general statistics, like the data set that we all think are a reflection of society, are also biased. So it's really important to sorry, I should clarify, they are biased for male. Male are overrepresented in national statistics. That's why statistics behavior reflect what men do, not what women do. So what can we do to support a whole new generation of startups? There's some really incredible efforts going on. Salesforce, I know, has supported the World Economic Forum in doing Uplink, which is sort of a way to identify some of these ecopreneurs and match them up with companies that could be buy their services, or governments that are in need of their products. At Climate Collective, we run accelerators. So I would think of ourselves as sort of a community and an accelerator. We're a community in the sense that we're a safe space where entrepreneurs, nonprofits, scientists, and investors come together and talk about policy. Policy is changing so fast. I mean, even just now in Baku, I mean, we've had several webinars after Baku just talking through what happened, what didn't happen, what does the new targets mean, how as a business should you kind of relate to this or not. So I think creating these strong ecosystems that are enabling and allows entrepreneurs to trial and error is so important. Nature tech, climate tech is different from digital tech. So that's just a word of warning. It's not as VC friendly as a lot of these sort of digital innovations where VCs come in and VCs, venture capitalists come in and expect 100x on their investments. Nature technologies, climate technologies, they take time. Sometimes you're funding first of a kind solution that needs time to mature. So I would say keep keep the door open and engage with entrepreneurs. Many of you who are maybe policymakers know the effort it takes to keep track of these policy instruments and sort of the Paris Declaration and all of these different global policy instruments that set the course of direction. For an entrepreneur that's working really hard to just build their product and go to market, they're not as tuned in to that world. So that's another place where joining an accelerator, where we help translate what's going on in the world with governments or corporations to these entrepreneurs and help them sort of pivot their product that it actually meets where the market is or where the demand is taking place.
Thank you, Anna. And looking forward to the outcomes of the accelerator, as well as to reviewing the framework, which is, as I said, is a lot of the heavy lifting for everybody to get a better understanding of where we can focus on opportunities. We'll go to the questions now, and there's a lot of them in the Q&A, but you've made it easy for us by voting some of them up or down. And before that, just a quick check-in on our poll here. So on the call, we have a surprisingly high amount of private sector, UN, NGOs, academia, government, and other. Next. And what level of AI knowledge and usage? Intermediate, interestingly. Okay. I use AI tools frequently. A few AI pros on the call. That's also great. Please also get engaged in the Q&A, and you can comment on some of the questions. And AI novices. Okay, so that's a mixed audience. That's great. Next. Beware of key data protections and data rights legislation in your country. No. So that seems to be the majority. And it's a fast developing, as Anna said, fast developing policy field. And even the EU AI law is very complex. So my respect to those 45% who are aware of key data protections in their country, because it's a complicated field and fast evolving, but very important for all of us to learn more about this. And next slide, please. And you see AI mainly as a risk opportunity, or both? Both, by far the majority. I think that's also what we heard from the panel, and is also reflected in the question. So thank you for showing the poll results, the UNEP team. And we'll go to the questions now. And the way we will do that is because they're all in the Q&A. I will give questions that I see here to individual panelists, and I will list now which questions I'll give to whom, so you can already prepare, Anna and Clinton and Jesper and Keith and Nawe. So there's a question from Rachel Marie Christensen. How could AI assist with optimizing the implementation of environmental legislation, such as the EU Nature Restoration Regulation? Anna, I would love to give that question to you and give you a little bit of time to think about it while we go through the other questions. There's one from Lee Ray Davis. How can AI be embedded into ecosystem restoration education to help engage local communities and future workforce? That is an open question to anybody. Clinton, if you feel inclined to take that, I think that would be a good one for you. We have a question on, do you have any case studies you can share where sensor technology was effectively used in combination with AI for conservation purposes? From Cherry Muison, sorry for the pronunciation of your name. Thank you for the question, Cherry. Jesper, that one's for you. And then there's a question to Keith about bringing together various stakeholders and their data. How can the value of collaboration best be shared? So this is about benefit sharing in these smallholder farmer outreach, and if there's best practice. And I saw a question for Nawe here. How can ground level data collection be scaled up to involve local communities more? That would be for you, Nawe. We'll start with those. And there's also a question about the risks of AI and social credit systems. I will answer that because I just finished reading Nexus by Yuval Noah Harari. If you haven't read it, absolute essential reading for the topic of AI. So, and we've of course looked into the EU AI legislation. So I'll take that question from Ann-Kathrin. Right, so let's get started. Anna, we'll start again with you. How AI could assist optimizing EU nature legislation implementation?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think I mentioned one already. There is a world where we create an AI agent that is specifically trained on how to implement this legislation for different actors. So let's say you're a business and you go to the simple example that I'll give, and it's a bad example because it's not a good user experience. But you know, when you go to an airline and like your ticket isn't issued, or you're trying to like ask about a different flight, and this little AI agent pops up and like, how can I help you? And you're saying, well, my ticket wasn't issued. I don't understand. How can I help you? My ticket isn't issued. How can I help you? So today I would say the experience isn't great. But in the soon future, I would argue that these experiences will be much better. And having an AI agent, almost like a buddy at the table or a colleague at the table, if you are, let's say I'm Swedish, here I'm sitting in the government of Sweden, and I'm trying to figure out how do I take this EU nature restoration law and I implement it in Sweden? Where are the most cost-effective areas to focus on in Sweden? What is the most recent data that we can do to update maybe our forest maps? And can we use a colleague, a virtual agent colleague that sits around the table and help us answer some of those more like heavy lifting? Sometimes I think of AI as the workhorse. Like you need to do a couple of different things. It's going to take a really long time to pull that data set together or clean it up so your data colleague can put it into a graph and explain it to your boss as you're trying to explain the path forward. All of those sort of workhorse type of heavy lifting type of things AI can do so quickly. So those would be good examples. I also think that I have a thing for accountability, maybe because I've been in the climate diplomacy space for so long. A couple of years back, I wrote a paper for World Economic Forum where I talked about blockchain as a tool to hold parties to the convention, so parties to the Paris Agreement, the Climate Convention, for example, or the Biodiversity Convention, to hold them accountable for what they promise each year, right? Everyone goes to these meetings and say, okay, I promise to, this is my national determined contribution, this is my NDC, I promise to do X, Y, Z. And then next year, they come back with a different report and the numbers are kind of different and they're using different. So it's really easy to not ensure accountability in these very complex processes. But I would argue with AI and blockchain, which is kind of a way to just transparently log, it's like a transparent database, if you will, that you can't really tamper with. We can ensure much more accountability. Same, like, let's keep all the EU countries accountable for when are they actually implementing the law? What areas are they designating as protected areas? And how are they going about, how are they investing day to day to make sure that we achieve those goals? For me, those are really good examples of how AI could help.
Thank you very much, Anna. And indeed, I would look forward to an agent on the EU nature restoration law because there was a lot of questions in how many EU languages are there? And of course, one of the advantages of an agent is that it could do that in any language and at any time of day or night. So that would indeed be useful. Clinton, are you ready to help us navigate how to embed ecosystem restoration education to help local communities and future workforce? There's of course a huge link between AI and education that we haven't really touched upon much yet.
I think first of all, I missed the question because I was busy addressing like the other question on insurance. Maybe if you can just point to me again the question.
Yeah, sorry, it's the one from Lee Ray Davis, and he's asking, how can AI be embedded into ecosystem restoration education to help engage local communities and future workforce?
Yeah, I think like to that, like I can just go back to something that has already been mentioned by a colleague here, whereby actually, and if I can just bring out like an interesting project that we tried out, whereby we realized like in our side, we are building like a technology to assist like the farmers improve their farmlands. And most of the time, what we usually come up with are just technical terms. So for example, most of the time we use remote sensing products such as NDVI, which is just a proxy for how green or how a vegetative, how like a healthy a vegetative of a farm is. And what you realize is that you can't just force this to the people because they won't understand. So what we try to do is some sort of a copilot that can interpret like this complex stuff into like something that it's so easy for the end users to understand and act on. So I think that's one of them. The other one is trying to interact with, for example, when you go to most of the smallholder farmers, they usually organized in something called cooperatives, whereby they, after they have harvested their produce, they'll go sell to the cooperatives. And most of the time, these cooperatives are the ones usually also like help like these farmers improve on their farm productivity and the rest. So we realize also sometimes we ask ourselves like whose role is it to drive that kind of education or that kind of knowledge transfer, and we realize that sometimes we might be forcing ourselves in things that we are not best at, and we realize that sometimes some form of collaboration with the current system that currently works sometimes really just the best. If at all I answered the question. Yeah.
Yes, and obviously for many schools and universities, the initial response was to try to get their students to use less AI because obviously you can write an essay much faster with ChatGPT, but that is now shifting to teaching how to use AI wisely and well, and how to ask how to design the right prompts, what to ask for, how to use the different AI tools. So I think that shift has been fairly rapid, but there's still a lot to do specifically on an environmental education. So we'll keep also sharing we'll share the resources that you shared with us before the call, Clinton, with everybody here. And from Salesforce side, there's a lot of philanthropy from our foundation that focuses on AI and education. So I can also add a few resources there. So Jesper, we'll come to you next with this question. Do you have any case studies you can share where sensor technology was effectively used in combination with AI for conservation purposes? I think you already spoke about the regreening restoration activity. Is there anything else you can share? It's a question from Sherry Muison.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think maybe first it's good to explain a little bit what sensor technology is, because it's a bit of a difficult word, but I think sensor technology is basically anything that you sense. So it can be an image, or it can be a CO2 sensor, or like anything, and we can train models around it, right? So the example that I gave about how we predict indicators such as soil organic carbon, tree cover, pH, nitrogen, using satellite data, that is already an example of how we use sensor technology in combination with AI. For monitoring. But I think to give another example, because I already talked about that specific application to sensor technology, but another example could, for instance, be having a tool where you take where you do some sort of tree planting, and you take an image of your location, and based on your surroundings and your location, the app can recommend some tree species to plant, right? That could already be based on the photo that you take with your phone. And then based on some models that we have in the background, we can already then give predictions on which tree species might be suitable for these type of locations. And actually within our organizations, we already have models, and we already have created an app that actually does exactly this. Based on your location, we can give recommendations on what to plant based on natural occurrence of species. And I think to go a little bit more, because I'm trying to maybe integrate one other question that I saw as well about citizen science and about farmer monitoring, right? Within the Regreening Africa project, we created an application for citizen science monitoring of the restoration interventions, and it's been used by more than 200,000 farmers already all across the world. So these type of technologies, because these apps are already being used, we can then include these type of technologies of which tree species to plant, or maybe which identification of tree species, and incorporate them into applications. So like this application that is already being used by farmers to actually also get a high uptake of these kind of tools. And yeah, I think that is a way how we can use the sort of images that are being fed by people on the ground, and then we can sort of use models in the background to give this kind of these predictions at a very local level. Yeah, maybe that is a little bit two questions that I'm trying to combine into one answer.
But I appreciate that, because there are literally dozens of questions, and we unfortunately won't be able to tackle all of them. But the UNEP team will collect all of them, and hopefully we can answer some of them after the webinar. So let's go to Nawe first, because there are two questions here that have been fairly popular, and I'll give you a dealer's choice, which one you want to answer. First one is, how can ground level data collection be scaled up to involve local communities more? And the other question that I thought was very relevant here, where does blockchain fit into this the context of securing indigenous land rights while certifying proof of environmental outcomes from restoration efforts?
I think both.
Pick one or answer both.
I will answer both they tie together, and I will add a little bit ties up to the conversation. I think all the panelists in here, we have acknowledged one key language in AI, and this is data quality. And this is about, like, there is a silos of data. There exists data in different formats and different ecosystems. And AI could help us streamline that, make those connections. But that relies heavily in the metadata, right? Like it really, to one of the panelists' points, otherwise we just flying blind, like data becomes valuable when it has its provenance and its permanence to the metadata where it belongs. That gives the key insight. A farmer that wants to be regenerative and go into transformation of the landscape, is not useful a data in soil health global. That doesn't mean anything. It's useful when it's at the very least bioregional. It's even more useful when it's local. So that needs to be very clear, like a remote sensing, like we have satellite imagery, we have also airborne imagery, then we have airplane imagery, and then we have drones. Then you can see the scale. Drones gives you a very localized information. The ones you pair when the community's knowledge of the land, it becomes extremely valuable. So in that context, when we think about how we bring local communities into the conversation, is we really are depending on the metadata. Therefore, we need to clearly create the deeds and titles that the data belongs to. That way, that data, it doesn't lose the meta information when it moves across the value chain. It doesn't lose it. And also, that data could enter into the data economy, meaning if this repository of data can enter into training, as you mentioned, into training models that reduces biases and prejudices, that is a form of data economy. So if we want to really involve local communities and indigenous communities in data collection, we need to involve them in the data economy. And the best way to do that is creating these digital legitimacy deeds and titles to their data. And that comes into very important thing. Why these deeds are important is because then we move to the second piece of it to really bring into data collection is data disaggregation. And data disaggregation is where a lot of the concerns falls in, because in disaggregation can really continuously discriminate a lot of this population into accessing some of the benefits that are coming from this data, some of the findings as insight that's coming from the data. If they cannot connect and make true of their realities in the data, they will be discriminated. So two things comes very important in there. One is the right of self-identification. The second is the right of self-determination. And both of them, they share pre-informed consent regardless if you are an indigenous people or local community. Pre-informed consent should be a universal human rights in data, because we are really asking them for, in many cases, it is a private knowledge that we are asking. Perhaps not demographics, but it still is a private knowledge. So the collector, it needs to be aware of why the data is being collected, what is the intention of the data, when it's being collected. Those two pieces will actually fall into creating the integration into the collection. But it can no longer be the Trojan horse of big data. By bringing indigenous communities or local communities as volunteers, and also as a pro bono collaborators, when the notion of community engagement, we are incentivizing a big data Trojan horse on training our technologies and training our models without truly meaningfully participation or benefit sharing of this. So this ties to the question of blockchain. Blockchain will play a crucial role when we are creating this digital deeds across the value chain. And we can create this in a two-way verification method. At a very high level, when an investor wants to know where am I investing, how it's doing, you use certifiers to understand how good is doing my investment. But at the ground level, there is no compliance. There is no grievances. By blockchain, to the point of Anna, where I was talking about, can we hold you accountable? Can we really hold you accountable to the promise that you made to me? That is where blockchain and the digital deeds, legitimacy deeds and titles to their data, because now it becomes part of the data economics. That is an income source that could be fueling education accessibility, could be fueling e-learning platforms that they can access to them. Those opportunities that this technology creates, but because they doesn't have a way of grievances and accountability and responsibility, right now, communities are seen as charity, are seen as beneficiaries. Let me, to the technologies and developers, they are co-designers of the data prototyping. That's what they are. And they have a home core advantage. They are negotiating from their point. Blockchain, it will come very, very importantly to play a role into this. As I mentioned early on, there is a lot of land that is becoming the Wild West, if you want to put it that way. When climate change, a lot of mountain regions are depleting glaciers. Those lands, it might enter into deposition and land grabbing. Forests as being destroyed. Those lands become dispossessed very quickly because it doesn't have a way to weigh into the titling, into cultural possession of the land. Blockchain will play a role if we are having a co-design data prototyping approach that really brings that community, the local community, they brings across the whole way into the data economy, and the benefit circle backs. That is education, that is our data rights. But this is not about right now demanding about the rights. It's about right now is about implementing the existing rights, enforcing the existing rights, using technology like AI, blockchain, to hold them accountable and responsible for the promises they have put in our lands.
Indeed, and it's of course great that we can build on now over a decade of experience with free, prior, and informed consent and questions around rights, and extend that to data, because we might enter a world where data becomes more important than money, and who has control over the data is of course essential. So thank you again for the work. For joining.
We are in the digital age of privacy, so we need to continuously build these rules and negotiations, and the whole core advantage is becoming important.
Exactly, and thank you also for the research that you're doing on this topic, and I hope you can share some of this with this group. We have a few minutes left, and we'll come last but not least to Keith with this question about benefit sharing. So Keith, how best to overcome the dilemma where the gains from that kind of work are distributed, and how can the value of that collaboration best be shared?
Yeah, great question. And the way we're looking at this is twofold. One is design. Too often the designs of these interventions, these programs, are looked at as a bilateral program or involving 2 or 3 stakeholders. So first, we think the project preparation phases of these interventions, of these deployments and programming should be done holistically, accounting for the different stakeholders and understanding what are the value propositions that are going to be achieved across each stakeholder. But ultimately, the design should be built around the well-being of farmers or the stakeholders on the ground in those communities. And we believe that representation of these stakeholders is key in the design phase, in the implementation phase. And while a leading CPG brand or a financier or input supplier or technology provider has a very clear focus on what they want to achieve from the program, it needs to be aligned to the well-being of the stakeholders on the ground and how they're going to tangibly create that value. So we see this as a design phase challenge and solution, as well as a representation solution, so that the development of these programs, these landscapes, these interventions needs to start with who are the folks on the ground who are going to benefit, and how do they engage with this program, so that while every stakeholder must have a value proposition, they should be aligned to what is happening at the ground level.
Yeah, thank you. This also ties in with the question that Anne-Catherine raised. There's a risk of AI not working in an inclusive way, but in a way that excludes certain users from, for example, insurance or different credit systems. And there is, of course, a role to play for legislation here. Just want to point out that the EU AI legislation does explicitly prohibit social crediting systems, at least, but that, of course, is a matter of degree what that extends to. But this has been recognized in the EU AI law as a risk. So thank you for raising that as a question. I would, since we've come to the end of our allotted time, like to thank all of our panelists, first of all, for making the time. Thank you so much. This was a fascinating discussion, and thank you also for sharing generously resources that we can pass on to all the participants. I'd like to thank all the participants for spending time with us, and please do engage on this topic. This is the most defining technology of our time, and we all have to weigh in, even if you're not very interested in technology, because the way we program and teach these large language models and other AI innovations and agents will define a lot of the future world economy. So it is absolutely essential that we all weigh in. And last but not least, thanks to the UNEP team for putting up this webinar and for guiding us through today's polls, and for the logistics and for following up with participants with all the resources that we've collected. So thank you, everybody, and we'll be back with more. If there are specific areas of interest raised into the UNEP team, we can put up a webinar that dives deeper into specific questions, for example, around benefit sharing or around remote sensing and monitoring. And thank you all until the next time. Take care.